For your ears only for the week of March 23rd, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Exelberth with a quote from the news. Sometimes an erratic flight path is heroism, not terrorism. That was Mary Schiavo, former U.S. Transportation Department Inspector General, on the missing Malaysian jetliner whose autopilot was reset before it lost contact, perhaps towards a nearby landing strip because of an in-flight emergency, or further to the vast and deep Indian Ocean to prevent a devastating crash into populated areas. Several satellite sightings led to extensive searching over those waters off Australia's coast. Now this.
We
had a referendum which took place in the Crimea, fully consistent with all norms of international law. More than 82% of voters took place, and more than 96% of those who voted for reunification with Russia.
We are imposing sanctions on specific individuals responsible for undermining the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and government of Ukraine.
There are now travel bans and asset freezes, and if Russia takes further action to destabilize the Ukraine and to threaten its territorial integrity, there will be further consequences.
In the days that followed those remarks by Russian President Vladimir Putin, U.S. President Barack Obama, and British Prime Minister David Cameron, the world moved nervously closer to Cold War-style confrontation. Putin signed legislation to make Crimea part of his country again and launched military exercises on the border with Ukraine. Obama escalated sanctions against key figures in Putin's inner circle and sent some military units to NATO nations. And the European Union formalized closer economic ties with Kiev, essentially the step that alienated Crimea's Russian majority in the first place.
To consider the factors that led up to the new East-West standoff and what may come next for your ears only, we're joined by Tara Sonenshine, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, who visited Ukraine just last year. She's currently a distinguished fellow in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
U.S. sanctions against Putin insiders seem somehow small bore versus the major national and international interests at stake. But are those individuals really key to the way the regime in Moscow functions, with real influence on what Putin does next?
Well, let's first step back and remember that Putin took Crimea, and I think we can now say took Crimea, with military might and propaganda. The West is responding with economic pressure, and I do think this second round of U.S. sanctions will bite. We're talking about freezing assets and slapping travel bans on real Putin insiders, including his personal banker, Yuri Kovalchuk. And we've hit Bank Rossiya, which I do think is going to lead to Russian stocks suffering. You see Visa and MasterCard already ending services to those who bank with Bank Rossiya. So I do think this is the beginning of an economic fortress that may really pinch.
Is Ukraine in a way more stable without the strong pro-Russian population of Crimea challenging Ukrainian interests, culture, values?
Well, it's a good question, because I think when you start cutting off the Russian limbs of a country, if you will, you start sowing internal division. And frankly, you make other ethnic Russians in other parts of the former Soviet Union very anxious. You've got Russian populations in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova.
How do you compare the U.S. sanctions with those enacted by the EU?
The EU sanctions certainly mirror U.S. sanctions, but are, I would say, a bit less imposing, only because you've got so many nations that have come to agreement when you're talking about EU sanctions. But I think if the EU and the U.S. are serious about enacting all these sanctions, it could have an effect long-term, similar to what we've seen happen in Iran, where the nation really suffered from sanctions and is now practically begging for inclusion in the West.
How do the sums of financial aid and loan guarantees from the EU and Washington compare with Ukraine's actual needs?
Ukraine is really suffering, and one does worry about whether the loan guarantees and the IMF package will be fast enough in affecting change. $1 billion of loan guarantees from the U.S. sounds like a lot, but remember that Ukraine has been struggling under the weight of this Russian intervention for a long time, and you've seen lavish palaces and other spending issues that makes me concerned that there's been a lot of money siphoned off from Ukraine, and that puts it behind the eight ball from the beginning. Having been there, the educational system needs a lot of strengthening, and Ukraine needs investments in rule of law, democratic institutions, independent media, and its gas shale resources, which maybe this is an opportunity to help them exploit.
Talk about the key role ahead you see for German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the strain in Washington-Berlin relations because of NSA communication surveillance.
Well, Germany clearly has a pivotal role to play if you just look at the map and geographically vis-a-vis Ukraine and its whole NATO relationship. The U.S.-German relationship has been strained by the disclosures from Snowden, but as much as these things create short-term frictions and tensions, I think long-term we are going to want to work very closely with Merkel. She's been playing the role of go-between, if you will, with Putin, sort of the good cop, bad cop. On a given day, she's on the phone trying to persuade him to come down off this limb, and other times threatening. She's also been one of the first to mention that Putin seems not really totally clear and of this universe at times in the way he's approaching things. So I think she's an honest broker, and I think that relationship's going to be important.
Another test of international relations last week was response to the missing Malaysian jetliner, and you noted that such crises in the air, sea, and space often bring out unusual cooperation. But don't we seem to see nations withholding and delaying information that shows their radar, satellite, and other intelligence capabilities in the Malaysian Air case?
Boy, it has been a real rocky road, literally a roller coaster for the families and for all of us watching, and for the governments in their disclosure and dissemination. Although for all the uneven dissemination in the last day or so, you've seen literally the Malaysian authorities reading a note about Chinese satellites, literally being handed a piece of paper during a briefing. So this has been literally and figuratively all over the map. My point in my writings has been that a crisis in the air like this or in the ocean creates strange bedfellows. These events remind us that particularly when you're not on land with borders and passports and visas and armies and troops, you are forced to work with nations that you argue about on many topics because you simply have no choice.
Tara Sonenshine is a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, currently a distinguished fellow in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University.
Quote from the news, "You are being too pessimistic." That was Osama bin Laden after 9/11 when his son-in-law, Suleiman Abu Ghaith, warned that the U.S. would eventually kill him and topple the Taliban in Afghanistan. Ghaith testified about it at his New York trial on charges of complicity with the plot.
Next, not safe and sound on the ground. Toyota and GM, for your ears only.